Military man returns home after 3 years, but what he finds leaves him speechless. Caleb had spent 3 years waiting for this moment. 3 years counting the days, the months, writing letters that arrived crumpled and late, calling from a payphone on his days off just to hear his mother's voice for 2 minutes. And now, after all that, he was back. With his backpack on his shoulders, his camouflage jacket still smelling of another life, he walked down the dirt road that led to the family ranch, the one he knew by heart, every curve, every rock. That's when he stopped. Up ahead, where the wooden gate with the family name painted by hand should have been, there were squad cars. Cars with lights flashing, blue and red cutting through the ember-colored sky of that late afternoon. A yellow tape stretched from fence to fence, blocking the way, and a handful of men in vests, walking around inside, checking papers, talking among themselves with that seriousness of people who aren't messing around. Caleb didn't understand. He looked again, as if looking again would change the image. It didn't change. He took a few more steps forward, the heavy backpack on his back, his chest starting to tighten in a way he hadn't felt since the worst moments of his service. When he got close to the tape, one of the men raised a hand toward him. "Restricted area, sir. Do you have any connection to this property?" Caleb took a second to answer. "This ranch belongs to my family. I'm Caleb Harrison, son of Arthur Harrison." The man wrote the name down on a notepad without changing his expression. "Could you wait over there, sir? There's a lady who's also waiting." Caleb turned his head in the direction the man indicated, and that's when he saw her, leaning against the wooden fence, her arms crossed over her chest as if she were trying to hold herself together, was his mother, Mrs. Brenda, 62 years old, white hair tied up with a blue scarf, the same flowered apron she had worn for years, and she was crying. Not a loud cry. It was that quiet cry of someone who has been crying for a while and doesn't have the strength to sob anymore, just the tears streaming down. Caleb went to her almost running. "Mom." She looked up, and for a second it seemed like she didn't believe he was real. She stared at her son standing in front of her in the same camouflage jacket from the last photos he had sent, taller than she remembered. Or maybe she had shrunk a little under the weight of the past few months. Cal. He hugged her with the backpack still on his back, felt her small, tense body in his arms, and stayed like that for a while without saying anything. Sometimes there aren't words that come close to what needs to be said. When he pulled back a little to look at her face, she was already trying to compose herself. "What happened, Mum? What's all this?" She paused in that way he knew well, the pause of when things were too complicated to start explaining from any point. "Glenda took it to court," she said finally. "Glenda and her lawyer. They say Dylan signed a paper giving up part of the ranch." Caleb felt that hit his chest like a rock. "What paper? What Dylan signed?" "While you were away, son, while your father got sick and Dylan was left alone taking care of everything." She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't have to. "Look, when I first read this part, I had to stop for a moment. Because it's exactly the kind of situation that happens when a family is vulnerable. Someone always shows up, always to take advantage. Mrs. Glenda was Mr. Arthur's sister, 5 years younger. She always had that love and competition relationship with her brother, the kind that lasts a lifetime without ever really being resolved. When their parents passed away, the ranch went to Arthur, and Glenda never forgot. She spent decades feeding that quiet grudge, waiting for the right moment. And the right moment came when Arthur had a collapse in blood pressure that kept him bedridden for nearly 4 months. Weak, medicated, away from day-to-day decisions. And Dylan, 24 years old with no experience, with Caleb not around, trying to hold everything together on his own. "Where is Dylan now?" Caleb asked. "At home, in his room. He hasn't left there in 2 days. And my father? He's in his room too. When he saw the squad cars arrive this afternoon, his blood pressure shot up again. I called the neighbor who's a nurse. She's with him now." Caleb took a deep breath. He looked at the house behind the tape, the lit windows, the thin smoke coming out of the chimney. That house he had painted with his father when he was 15. That porch where his mother had coffee every morning, that old silo beside it that creaked when the wind blew hard. He wasn't going to let them take that away. "Tell me everything, Mum, from the beginning." She started telling him right there, leaning against the fence, with the sky turning purple in the background and the squad car lights flashing non-stop. 6 months earlier, when Mr. Arthur was still recovering, Aunt Glenda showed up at the ranch with a lawyer. She said she had an old document proving that their father had left the ranch to both of them, not just to Arthur, that there had been an injustice in the division, that she only wanted what was rightfully hers. Dylan, not knowing what to do, unable to consult his father, who was weak, and without Caleb to call, let Glenda's lawyer speak. And when a paper came to sign, which seemed, according to them, just an acknowledgement that the matter was being reviewed, Dylan signed it. It was not an acknowledgement of review, it was a partial assignment of rights to the property. "Dylan didn't read it properly?" Caleb asked, with a mix of anger and pity that he himself couldn't quite sort out inside. He read it, but the lawyer explained it in a way that made it seem like something else. "Dylan is 24, Cal. He doesn't have experience with these things." Caleb closed his eyes for a second. It wasn't anger at his brother. It was that anger of someone who understands that his brother was used, and that's almost worse than if he had made the mistake on his own. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, go ahead and leave a like and especially subscribe to the channel. It helps us a lot who are just starting out. Now, continuing. That night, after the men in vests had left, they would return in 3 days for a new inspection. Caleb finally entered the house. The ranch had that smell of old wood and warm food that he had tried to remember for 3 years and never could quite accurately. Some things only exist when you're in the right place. He went straight to his father's room. Mr. Arthur was lying down, covered with a wool blanket, his face thinner than Caleb remembered. 65 years that seemed to have turned into 70 in those months of illness and worry. But his eyes were the same, those eyes that saw far, that calculated everything in silence before speaking, that had never lost that particular sparkle. "My son," said the old man, trying to sit up. "Stay still, Dad. Don't need to move." Caleb pulled up a chair and sat beside the bed. For a while they stayed like that, looking at each other, with that language that father and son sometimes have, and that doesn't need any words to work. "I know what happened," Caleb said finally. "I didn't want you to come home to this. But I did. And now we need to fix it." Mr. Arthur turned his face to the window. Outside, the night had fully closed in, and the field was dark and quiet, as it had been for decades. "There's something you need to know," the old man said slowly, with that caution of someone about to open something that had been shut for a long time. "When Glenda's parents and mine passed away, the document that remained was clear. The ranch was mine, but my father, before that, he left another paper. A separate paper, kept with Otis." Caleb lifted his head. "Otis? The neighbor?" "Mr. Otis. He was a friend of your grandfather's long before I was born. Your grandfather entrusted him with an envelope, saying it should only be opened if the ranch ever came into dispute. I never needed to open it because it had never been disputed, but now—" "Why did you never tell me this?" Mr. Arthur was quiet for a moment longer than the others. "Because I hoped it wouldn't be necessary, and because I didn't want you to carry that weight while you were far away, unable to do anything." Caleb stared at his father. That man who spent his whole life trying to shield his children from burdens, who thought that protecting meant keeping problems away from others, and who sometimes, by shielding too much, left them unarmed exactly when they most needed to know the truth. I had to take a deep breath here, because what the old man did, keeping that thing for years without telling, makes sense and at the same time complicates everything. That's how fathers are, right? They think protecting means hiding. But the problem doesn't disappear just because it's hidden. The next morning, Caleb went to Mr. Otis's house. The neighbor's property was about a 20-minute walk away, along the shortcut that cut through the tall grass. Caleb had walked that path dozens of times as a child, ran along it barefoot when he was a boy. Otis was a 68-year-old man with that country way of speaking slowly and thinking twice before opening his mouth. He had been a friend of Caleb's grandfather and later of his father, the kind of friendship that spans generations without losing its thread. When Caleb knocked on the door, Mr. Otis answered in less than a minute, as if he already knew this moment would come sooner or later. "Caleb, I heard you were back. I got in yesterday. Come in." The neighbor's house was simple, smelling of coffee and old wood. They sat at the kitchen table, and Caleb got straight to the point. "My father told me about an envelope that my grandfather left with you, Mr." Otis was quiet for a moment, looking at his own hands. They were hands from a lifetime of working in the fields, with those marks that time leaves on someone who never stopped. "Your grandfather asked me for something very specific," he said. "He asked me to keep it and not to hand it over to anyone unless the ranch was being contested, and only to give it to Arthur or to whoever Arthur personally sent." "My father sent me." Mr. Otis nodded slowly, got up unhurriedly, went to an old cabinet in the corner of the room, opened the bottom drawer, and brought out a brown envelope, worn with age, with the name Arthur handwritten on the front in that careful handwriting that older people had. Caleb looked at the envelope as if he were looking at something he still didn't quite understand. He didn't open it there. He took it to his father. Back at the ranch, they sat together on the bed, Mr. Arthur with trembling hands, Caleb beside him, and carefully opened the envelope. Inside was a letter written by the grandfather on the back of a notebook page, with firm and heartfelt handwriting, and alongside it, a document signed by a notary from decades ago, formally recognizing that the property belonged to Arthur by the express and exclusive will of their father without division, and that any future contestation would be considered groundless by the document itself. The document was dated. It had a notarized seal. It was legitimate. Caleb felt the air rush back into his lungs. But then came the first bucket of cold water. When they took the document to the lawyer that Dylan had hastily brought in to defend the family, the man read everything carefully, leafed through it twice, and then looked at Caleb with that face nobody wants to see on a lawyer. "This document is valid, yes. The problem is that Glenda has already filed her contestation beforehand, and the paper that Dylan signed creates a legal knot that won't be easy to untie. It depends on how the judge interprets it. But Grandpa's document clearly says it does. But Glenda's lawyer is going to argue that Dylan, as the heir present at the time, had the power to represent the estate, and that the old document was kept informally without ever being officially filed with the county clerk's office." Caleb looked at his brother, who was sitting in a corner of the room, knees together, eyes on the floor. Dylan was 24 years old and carried that weight on his shoulders like a huge stone. Caleb knew that weight. It was the weight of someone who made a mistake without meaning to and doesn't know how to undo it. "Dylan," he called. His brother looked up. "Did you know what you were signing?" A long pause. The kind that says more than any answer. "I didn't know everything. I knew it was something about the ranch, but they said it was just a review paper, that it didn't count as a transfer. You signed without reading it carefully. It wasn't an accusation, it was a statement, and Dylan knew it." "I was scared, Caleb. Dad was sick. You were far away, and they showed up with everything ready, with that lawyer using words I didn't understand. I was lost." Caleb stood up and went over to his brother. He put his hand on his shoulder, without squeezing, just placed it there. "Then tell me everything, every detail you remember, because if you were induced to sign something believing it was something else, that makes a legal difference." And so he started telling. Dylan told everything he could remember, and Caleb stored each piece of information with the same care he had learned on the job when the situation was delicate. The exact day of the visit, the words Glenda's lawyer had used. The argument that the paper was just a formality for acknowledgement, and, most importantly, the fact that Dylan had explicitly asked if it compromised the property, and the lawyer had answered no, that it was just a formality. That was crucial. If there had been inducement into error, the document Dylan signed could be contested. The family's lawyer listened to it all again, and this time his expression shifted slightly. "That changes things. If we can prove there was inducement into error, the transfer can be annulled. But we need a witness, someone who was there when it happened and heard what that lawyer said." Dylan thought about it. The effort to stir his memory was visible. Mrs. Pearl was there, The neighbor who was helping around the house when Dad got sick. She was on the porch when they arrived. She heard part of the conversation. Caleb felt a spark ignite. Where does Mrs. Pearl live? On the Upper Ridge Road, the second house after the big eucalyptus tree. He went that same day while the afternoon light was still good. Mrs. Pearl was 67 years old, with a sharp memory that many younger people would envy, and an honesty that wouldn't bend under any pressure. When Caleb arrived and explained the situation, she didn't hesitate for a second. I did hear it. I heard that man tell Dylan that the paper didn't commit him to anything, that it was just an acknowledgement that a dispute existed. I didn't understand exactly what it was, but I remembered because I found it odd the way he spoke, very fast, very close to the boy's ear, as if he was in a hurry to finish that explanation. Would you be willing to say that in a hearing? Mrs. Pearl looked at him with that calm of someone who has lived long enough to know that certain things need to be said out loud, even if it's a hassle. I will. That Glenda has always been like that, doing things on the sly. And Arthur doesn't deserve that after a lifetime of working this land. There are people like that, who show up when you need them most, asking for nothing in return, and without needing to be convinced that it's the right thing. Mrs. Pearl was one of them in this story, and I keep thinking, what would families do without those people who simply side with the truth because they do? Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, feel free to leave a like, and especially subscribe to the channel. It really helps us who are just starting out. Now continuing, what came next was difficult in a different way. It was no longer the doubt about whether they could prove the truth. It was the wear of waiting, of seeing his mom wake up every day with that tension on her face, of seeing his dad try to get up before he was ready because he wanted to be part of every decision, because it was his ranch, his life, and lying down while others decided was something Mr. Arthur didn't know how to do. Weeks went by, long ones. Aunt Glenda tried everything. First, she said her grandfather's document had been forged. When the county clerk's office confirmed the authenticity of the signature and date, she changed tactics and claimed that Mr. Otis had kept the envelope out of self-interest to harm her. When that also didn't hold up, her lawyer started questioning the state of the grandfather's health at the time the document was signed, trying to argue that the man wasn't in full condition to make that decision decades ago. Each new attack hit like a slap in the face. Caleb held it together on the outside. But there were nights when he would go out to the yard and stand still in the dark, staring at the open field, trying not to let exhaustion turn into despair. He had spent 3 years away learning to control what he felt, to separate what he could fix from what he couldn't. But controlling things here was harder, because here was real life, life with a face and smell and history, the life he himself was part of. On one of those nights, Mr. Arthur appeared at the back door, slowly, with the blanket over his shoulders and the leather slippers he had worn for years. "You shouldn't be up, Dad." "I can't sleep anyway." They stood side by side in the yard for a while, listening to the crickets, smelling the damp earth of the night. The old man spoke first. "I should have told you before, about the envelope, about Glenda, about everything I knew and kept inside. It's in the past." "No, it isn't. You came home and found this mess. I wanted you to come back and have the ranch the way you left it, in peace." Caleb looked at his father's profile. That man who never asked for help, who carried everything alone for decades, who thought the greatest proof of love was not passing the burden to others. "Dad, I came here precisely because this is where I want to be. It didn't have to be perfect." The old man was quiet for a long time. "Thank you for coming back," he said very softly, and that weighed more than anything that had been said in all those days together. The hearing took place on a weekday morning, in a small room at a courthouse in Denver, the nearest city to the region. Caleb went with his father, who insisted on appearing in person, even against the nurse's recommendation, and with Dylan, who walked into that room with a look on his face like he didn't know if he could stay seated until the end. Glenda was there, in a dark blazer, with her lawyer by her side. She and Arthur didn't look at each other when they walked in. The hearing was long. The family's lawyer presented the grandfather's document, the authenticity report, and the written testimony from Mr. Otis explaining the origin and safekeeping of the envelope. Then Mrs. Pearl was called. She walked in with that straight posture of someone who knows she's there to tell the truth, and that it's enough. When the question came about what she had heard that day on the porch, she told it. No beating around the bush, no drama, with the direct clarity of someone who tells the truth because it's the truth, period. Glenda's lawyer tried to question her memory, citing the distance she was at, the fact that she was a neighbor and therefore biased. Mrs. Pearl looked at him with a serenity that disarmed him. "I'm 67 years old, young man, and my memory is good enough to remember a lie when I hear one." What that man said to Dylan that day wasn't the truth of what was written on the paper. I heard it. The room went quiet for a moment. The judge didn't hide his expression. The decision wouldn't come that day. Caleb already knew that. A case is a case. It has its deadlines and procedures that won't speed up for anyone's will. But there was something in the room that had changed at that hearing. A turning of the tide that he felt, that Dylan felt, that his father felt, and that probably Glenda also felt, even if she wouldn't admit it. While they waited outside, Aunt Glenda passed by them on her way out. She stopped for a second in front of her brother, as if she were about to speak. The two stared at each other, two siblings, each in their early 60s, a lifetime of history between them. "You shouldn't have done this, Glenda," Mr. Arthur said quietly, no anger in his voice, just that sadness of someone who truly regrets. She opened her mouth, closed it, and left without answering. I don't know what goes through a person's head when they reach that point, when they let an old grudge fester for decades, until it comes to something like this. I think there are wounds we'll never truly understand. The decision came 15 days later, in writing. The transfer signed by Dylan was annulled due to a defect of consent, misrepresentation proven by the testimony and the evidence presented. The grandfather's document was recognized as valid and predating any challenge. The ranch remained entirely in Arthur Harrison's name, with no outstanding issues. Caleb read the paper at the kitchen table early in the morning, with his mother beside him and his father sitting in his usual chair, his back straighter than it had been in months. Mrs. Brenda didn't say anything. She just took her husband's hand and stayed like that, holding it, looking out the window where the morning sun came in. Dylan was in the doorway, hugging his own elbow with the other hand, that way of someone who still doesn't quite know how to carry relief when it finally arrives. Caleb carefully folded the paper, handed it back to his father. "Keep this in a good place this time." Mr. Arthur smiled. It was the first time Caleb had seen that true open smile since he'd arrived, the smile of the man he remembered from before. In the following days, the ranch slowly returned to its old rhythm, like a house getting back to normal after a storm. The men in vests didn't come back, the squad cars were gone, and the dirt road was left with only the usual dust of late afternoon and the sound of the surrounding fields. Mr. Arthur began to recover with more energy, as if lifting that weight off his chest had done for his health what no medicine could have done alone. Caleb stayed, not out of obligation, not because he had nowhere to go. He stayed because the decision came naturally, in one of those moments when you realize that the place you want to be and the place you need to be are exactly the same. He and Dylan worked together in the first few days, cleaning the fence that had been left neglected, fixing the barn roof that had started to give way. They didn't talk much about everything that had happened. They didn't need to. Sometimes the repair between two brothers doesn't come through long conversation, but through shoulder to shoulder on a morning's work, through the shared weight of a plank, through the silence that no longer weighs heavy. One afternoon, while they were fixing a fence post near the pasture fence, Dylan said, without looking at his brother, "I know I messed up. I know you know. I won't let it happen again." Caleb drove the post into the ground before answering, with that care of someone doing something meant to last. "I know that too." And that was enough. Mrs. Brenda went back to having her breakfast on the porch, with her usual cup and her gaze on the usual field. The smell of bread coming out of the oven once again filled the house in the morning. And Mr. Arthur, on a cooler morning a week later, showed up with his straw hat on and asked Caleb to go with him to the far end of the property, to check on the pasture that had gone untended all those months. They walked together through the field, the father a little slower than before, the son adjusting his stride without saying a word. The sun was low on the horizon, painting everything in that golden late afternoon light that Caleb had tried to remember for 3 years and had never quite managed to. "Are you staying?" the father asked, not turning his head, gazing out at the ranch horizon. "I'm staying," Caleb said. Mr. Arthur nodded slowly. "Good," he said, and that was all that needed to be said. End of story. This story touched me in a way I didn't expect when I started telling it. There's something about this mix of land, family, and time that we recognize from some corner of memory, even if the story isn't ours. Mrs. Brenda, Mr. Arthur, Caleb, these people stay with us after the story ends. What would you have done in Dylan's place, 24 years old, alone, with a sick father and a lawyer in front of you explaining things too fast? Leave it in the comments. I really want to read what you think. And tell me where you're watching from. I love knowing where each person who follows us comes from. If this story reached your heart, leave a like, share it with someone dear, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next ones. Thank you so much for always being here.